was exceptional at that, and she was brilliant, right?
Yeah. And then in terms of like cholesterol synthesis, you really need a very, very small amount of saturated fat for LDL cholesterol synthesis. Your liver can synthesize like the amount of LDL cholesterol or cholesterol that your body requires is so small in terms of like just living and being healthy. So I don't think you need to worry about that. And from a cardiovascular disease standpoint, there is some evidence that even taking people who have like quote unquote low LDL of like, 80 or 90 and taking them down to like 30 or 40, that there is still a benefit for the risk of cardiovascular disease. So again, you're weighing these two buckets, right? So what I say, if you're doing 7 to 10% from saturated fat, you're probably fine.
Received a lot of questions about whether or not there are female specific diet and exercise protocols. And I realize this is a vast landscape, but some of those questions related to menopause and premenopause, and some related to the menstrual cycle, most related to variations across the menstrual cycle. In terms of, let's just say diet, maintenance or subcaloric diet, are there any things that you've observed? We'll talk a little bit later about this wonderful app that you've produced, this Carbon app, which helps people manage their energy intake and a number of other things. And so there you have a sort of a database, or at least an experience base. And then I'm guessing there are probably also studies exploring male versus female differences in terms of adherence and what sorts of diets work. Are there any general themes that one can extract from that?
This is going to be a really unpopular segment for the women. Doesn't seem to make a big difference.
Well, actually, they may be relieved to hear that, because it makes sorting through the information space, and certainly the information we've covered in this podcast up until now, simpler. It means that everything isn't different for them. Yeah.
So if you look at the male versus female studies in relation to diet, they seem to respond to some similar way. Like similar calorie deficit seems to produce similar results. If you do low carb, high carb, regardless, it seems to boil down to the same principles. Now, training wise, we do know that the muscle fibers adapt a little bit differently to training, but without getting too far into the weeds, it doesn't really change the way you should train. Because for the most part, building muscle, there's a lot of different ways to build muscle. So we know that like light loads up to maybe like 30 reps, as long as it's taken close to failure, have basically the same effect on building muscle, at least in the short term, as heavy loads for low reps. It's mostly about taking the muscle close to fatigue or failure, right? You don't have to go to failure, but getting close within a few reps. If you're between 1 rep and 30 reps, if you're getting close to failure, seem to produce similar results. So again, great. You can pick with whichever form of discomfort you prefer, right? When it comes to female-specific training, again, females actually, this is one thing that a lot of people don't know. They actually put on a similar amount of lean mass as a percentage of their starting lean mass as men. In fact, there's no statistically significant difference in the amount of lean mass they put on. Now, the absolute amount of lean mass that's added will be greater for men because they started with a greater amount of lean mass. But the relative increase in lean mass is pretty much the same from similar training. Now, females, there's some differences in like fiber types. Females tend to be a little bit less fatigable than men. They can go a little bit harder, a little bit longer. And there's also some evidence that they recover a little bit better. But that also could be simply due to the fact that they're not able to use as heavy of loads to induce hypertrophy. So I kind of have this theory that while, as a percentage of your 1 rep max, you can program things, I think absolute load matters. When you look at like the most elite power lifters, the super heavyweights aren't squatting 3 or 4 times a week because, they're squatting 800-900 pounds.
They need more recovery.
I think that there's an overall recovery effect there. Again, I have no data to back this up. This is just my observation. But when you get into the lighter weight classes, and this goes for men too, you do see quite a few people who do, many training sessions at high RPEs and seem to be able to recover from that. So I do think the absolute load makes a difference. Now, when it comes to like menstrual cycle, this is one of those things where I kind of tell people, do what you prefer. So there's some people who have said you should like kind of schedule your training around your menstrual cycle, which is whenever you're going through your menstrual cycle, reduce the intensity, reduce the volume, because you're not going to feel as good, you're not going to train as well. What I would say is just auto-regulate that. If you go in and you're on your period, but you feel good and you're doing well that day, then I don't think you necessarily need to back it off. And there was one study that kind of supported that notion. But if you go in and you feel terrible and, you feel like you could use, a reduction in intensity and volume, then it's totally fine to auto-regulate that. And when I say auto-regulation, auto-regulation means you are regulating the individual training session based on your performance. So I auto-regulate insofar as I'm a super nerd, so I have a velocity device, so I can actually attach to the bar and see how fast the load moves, and I know at various different warm-up weights what velocities I should be hitting. So if I hit my last warm-up and my velocity is about 10% higher than usual, I can be pretty confident that that's going to be a good day for me. If it's lower, then I can back it off a little bit. In fact, at Worlds, when I hit my last deadlift, it was 30%. My last deadlift warm up, it was 30% faster than I usually hit in the gym. And I turned and looked at my coach and I said, "Yeah, we're going to get this today." Right. No, so there's various forms of ways to auto-regulate. But again, women, if you're on your period, but you feel good, I don't think there's any reason you need to back off. But if you're not feeling good, then it's totally appropriate to back off.
Raw versus cooked foods. People wanted to know whether or not, for instance, eating a raw apple versus, I don't know, does anyone cook apples? I guess you could, people used to bake, there were baked apples was a dessert when I was a kid. It was kind of the letdown dessert. Sorry, Mom. That was kind of not awesome unless it had a scoop of ice cream in it. And even then, maybe not awesome. But anyway, raw versus cooked. Obviously, if you burn a piece of meat to the point where it's pure charcoal, that's too much. And if you eat, there is a small movement surrounding eating raw meats. That's not something I particularly enjoy, frankly. Sushi is the only raw food I personally ingest, and I am very careful about the sourcing, frankly. Reputable places. Is there anything real about this in terms of being able to extract the amino acids, vitamins, and minerals from the food, raw versus cooked?
It just looks cool for Instagram. So when you cook foods, they actually tend to become, in terms of protein-containing foods, they tend to become more digestible, not less. Eggs are this way, meats are this way. People say, well, when you heat protein, you denature it. And I think they hear that word denature and they think destroy. And that is not what denature means. So proteins fold up into 3D dimensional structures, you know this, of course, based on their amino acid sequence and their specific energies of those amino acids. When you heat protein or add acid, it starts to unfold that protein structure. That happens during digestion anyway. So I always chuckle when like I've seen some companies come out with way that you can cook with, right? That's not going to destroy the amino acids. And I'm like, so you mean like regular whey, right? So typically cooking actually makes amino acids more bioavailable, not less. Now, I would stay away from charring your meat because there is some evidence that charring creates polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which at least in animals, when they give those, they appear to be carcinogenic. So if you do char your meat by accident, I would just cut off the charred portions, and then you should be fine.
The char is delicious. Not if it's charred too much, but there is something about a charred crust on a meat. My dad's Argentine, and I would like a good charred barbecue. Yeah. What about people referred to them in their questions as carb blockers, but I think what they're referring to are things like berberine and some of the glucose scavengers. And one glucose scavenger I'd love for you to comment on is this assertion that taking a brisk walk after a meal, or maybe even a slow walk after a meal, some movement can help downshift the amount of circulating glucose in some way. I've heard that. Not a lot of people, but some are starting to pay attention to this idea of taking things like berberine or even metformin can scavenge glucose. I personally can't take berberine. If I take it, I get massive headaches unless I've ingested tons of sugar and carbohydrates. So I just don't mess around with it. But I know there are a number of people out there that want to know whether or not these glucose scavengers can be useful.
I think that is really majoring in the minors, if I'm being honest. As far as like the carb blockers, there's like some white kidney bean extract and those sorts of things. They do block the digestion of carbohydrates, some. So when I say block, that's those watching or listening. Metabolism is typically not on and off switches. Okay, so when we say things like block or attenuate or inhibit, typically we're not talking about just a switch on the wall that you press it and everything turns off. We're talking about a dimmer switch. Okay, it just changes the emphasis. But these carb blockers can reduce the absorption of carbohydrate. Now, they don't seem to cause weight loss when you just do it a normal diet. Now, why is that? Well, all it does is once those carbohydrates get to the large intestine and your bacteria get a hold of them, they start fermenting them to volatile fatty acids, which get reabsorbed into your liver. So you don't get the increase in blood glucose, but you still get almost all the calories from it because it's just in a different form.
I see.
So, if carb blockers, if they actually worked really well, I mean, if you block something from being absorbed, your GI typically does not just let undigested material sit in there. You get diarrhea. I mean, that would be the outcome. It's also how I debunk the whole 30 grams of protein at a meal. You can't absorb any more than that. I'm like, if that was the case, when you ate a steak, you would just start having diarrhea every time you went over that 30 gram threshold, right?
I remember during college, so this would be early 90s, there was the Olestra craze.
Oh, yeah.
This idea of putting a non-digestible thing into things like potato chips so that it would clear through the GI tract faster, not absorb as many calories. It does raise, this went nowhere, obviously. You don't hear about this anymore, but it does raise an interesting question related to energy balance, which is gastric emptying time. Mm-hmm. And obviously in the landscape of eating disorders, in particular anorexia, use and abuse of laxatives is a way in which people will, in an unhealthy way, try and control their weight. And there's a lot of problems with that approach. But what about gastric emptying time? Is this one way that people could control their energy balance in a healthy way? And where does fiber come into play?
Fiber tends to improve GI transit time because it adds bulk. So, your GI system is basically a tube, and it has peristalsis, which is wave-like contractions that moves the food down through the tube. Well, if you have more bulk to the food, like with fiber, you can move it through a little bit better. Now, in the stomach specifically, fiber tends to delay gastric emptying and slow it a bit, probably because it congeals a little bit. Now, this kind of gets into the glycemic index argument, right? If you do low GI foods, you'll have a slower release of glucose. It's a slower gastric emptying time. Does that affect energy balance? And so there are quite a few studies looking at low GI versus high GI foods. In the studies where they don't control calories, low GI tends to outperform high GI, but when they control calories, there's no difference. And so what I think that suggests is low GI foods, just by their nature, tend to be higher in fiber. And so I think it just kind of comes back to the fiber issue.
Got it. I'd like to ask you about supplements for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's an enormous landscape, but I believe there are a few things that you believe in, meaning they exist. Sure. and there are decent data to support their use, maybe even some anecdotal data based on your own experience. As long as we highlight it as such, it could be interesting. I've heard you talk about two in particular, one that I'm very familiar with, which is creatine monohydrate. If you could share your thoughts on that, not just for muscle building, but maybe any other purposes for it. And then the other one is one that, frankly, I'm learning more about all the time now, thanks to your prompt, which is Rhodiola Rosea. Mm-hmm. I think I pronounced that correctly. And why that might be interesting or of use to people. Yeah,
so touching on creatine, it is the most tested, safe, and effective sports supplement we have. I mean, there are thousands of studies on creatine monohydrate now. And I would say very clearly too, if you're using any other form of creatine, I think you're wasting your money. Creatine hydrochloride has some hype around it. It's apparently a little more soluble. The claim is that you need less, but there's only a couple studies on it, and it's more expensive.
And
So
creatine monohydrate is not particularly expensive.
No,
right? I
well-
realize people have different budgets, but it's not. It doesn't land in the. It's not a budget breaker.
Yeah, it's gotten more expensive because of COVID and supply chain issues. Even there's forms of creatine that appear to be as good, like hydrochloride, but it's more expensive. And then things like creatine ethyl ester has been shown to be worse than creatine monohydrate. Buffered creatine is as good or worse, and it's much more expensive. So I tell people, just take creatine monohydrate. It is tried and true. It's been shown to saturate the muscle cells 100% with phosphocreatine, and that's what you want. So creatine works through a few different methodologies. One, through increasing phosphocreatine content, which helps improve exercise performance. It also appears to improve recovery, and it increases lean mass, a lot of which is through bringing water into the muscle cells. But that is, muscle cells are mostly water. So when people say, well, it's just water, that's what muscle cells mostly are. And it also increases strength and some other metrics. Now, it also has been shown in studies that people tend to get a decrease in body fat percentage. Now, that's probably because they're getting an increase in lean mass, and so the relative is a decrease in body fat percentage. But there are a few studies that show a decrease in fat mass as well. I don't think that creatine's a fat burner. I think that people are able to train harder, build more lean tissue, and so that's probably having an effect on fat mass. Then they've actually shown more recently some cognitive benefits to creatine, which I find really interesting as well. But the only knock on creatine that anybody's been able to come up with, because they've debunked the kidney stuff, they've debunked the liver stuff, there's no evidence that it harms healthy kidney or liver, is hair loss. So what about hair loss? Because there was one study in 2009 that showed that creatine increased DHT. But they didn't really show an effect on any other sex hormone. So it's kind of strange. Like, you would think if there was an increase in DHT, there would be like something else that changes as well. And it's only one study, and again, didn't directly measure hair loss, measured DHT, which we know is involved in the loss of the follicle. So what I would say is that I am not convinced. It's only one study, never been replicated to my knowledge, and it was looking at a mechanism rather than an outcome. So if you're somebody who's prone to hair loss and you want to avoid creatine because of that, I understand. But for most people, I don't think it's something to worry about.
Do you emphasize the classic loading of creatine, taking it a bunch of times per day and then backing off, or just taking it consistently at I think 5 grams per day is kind of the typical dose that people take?
So again, no solutions, only trade-offs. You can load it and you will saturate your phosphocreatine stores faster, like usually within a week. If you just take 5 grams per day, it'll take 2, 3, 4 weeks, but you will get to the same place. And you're probably going to have a much lower risk of GI issues. Some people, creatine can be a gut irritant. If it is for some folks, I would recommend splitting it into multiple doses. So maybe like multiple 1 or 2 gram doses per day. And definitely don't load it if you're somebody who has GI issues from it. As far as Rhodiola Rosea, the research is still in its infancy. I was just reading a new systematic review that kind of concluded that we need more high quality research, but the research that is out there seems to suggest that not only does it reduce physical fatigue, but it also reduces the perception of fatigue and may also enhance memory and cognition as well. And it's referred to as an adaptogen. So I really like it. My anecdotal experience is when I combine that with caffeine, it tends to kind of smooth out the effects of caffeine. It's a more pleasant experience. And there's also some evidence that if you're like coming off caffeine, that it can reduce the negative side effects to caffeine withdrawal, which, by the way, I didn't really believe in that until I actually did a cold turkey. So before a meet, I will cut out caffeine for 7 days because you can basically reset your caffeine tolerance in 7 days. And like 2 days in, I'm groggy. I've got the headaches. Usually I'll get like body aches that come up because caffeine is actually a mild analgesic. And yeah, so it was very interesting to see, but I slept like a baby. I'll tell you that.
And then you took caffeine prior to your event.
To the meet. Yeah.
So you really want the maximum punch from it.
Yeah.
That's why you do that.
Yeah. And like I said, rhodiola tends to it doesn't eliminate those negative effects, but it tends to dampen them a little bit. So I really like it. Again, would like to see more research on it, but there's a lot more stuff coming out. Like ashwagandha is another thing that looks pretty promising. Seems to increase testosterone modestly.
Interesting.
I don't think it's like they've shown increases in lean mass. I don't think the increase in testosterone explains the increase in lean mass. It's just not a big enough increase.
Could it be the decrease in cortisol? People have talked about.
It's possible. It does decrease stress hormones. It also has been shown to help with sleep. But I would like to see more research looking at mechanistically how it's increasing lean mass before I kind of say conclusively that this is the next creatine. There's more research that needs to come out, and then there's some other things that have an effect. Citrulline malate. There was a new meta-analysis that showed that citrulline malate can reduce fatigue and increase I think time to fatigue, and it may actually have some small recovery benefits as well. Different forms of carnitine can actually have recovery benefits, and actually interesting. I think it's carnitine tartrate. Actually has been shown, Volek published a study that actually showed that it increased androgen receptor density in muscle cells.